Today we're going to talk about the great Ukrainian money laundering scheme, what it is, what it isn't, and where that argument is coming from. Now, if you've spent any amount of time in the last few years trying to understand what's going on in the war between Ukraine and Russia, you've undoubtedly come across this argument. Just a quick search on Twitter or X today gave a few recent results. Things like the biggest money laundering exercise in history continues. The money laundering scam. McConnell is pushing for more money laundering to Ukraine. Biden wants more weapons, more American taxpayer dollars to go to his money laundering operation there. The problem is what they're yelling about isn't money laundering, which makes me think that the people using this argument are at best ill-informed or at worst discussing this issue in bad faith, causing further division here inside the United States. All right, so if we're going to talk about why this is not money laundering, we need to first start with what money laundering is. According to the United States Treasury, they say money laundering involves disguising financial assets so they can be used without detection of the illegal activity that produced them. Through money laundering, the criminal transforms the monetary proceeds derived from criminal activity into funds with an apparently legal source. So in the case of Ukraine, that money is already clean. It's coming directly from the United States government. Then to give you an idea of what money laundering could look like, let's say there's an organization selling illegal drugs across the United States. They can't take those millions of dollars in proceeds and plug them directly into the U.S. financial system, or it'll set off alarm bells and they'd probably get caught. So instead, maybe they buy a cash-rich business, something like, a casino out in the middle of nowhere, Missouri, let's say. They can, over time then, sprinkle in that illegal drug money to their legitimate gambling earnings, adjust the books, and then make those seemingly legitimate deposits into a U.S.-based account. They can then transfer that money through shell corporations and offshore accounts before funneling it back to an account in the United States, at which point it's been cleaned. And it's very hard to prove that the origin of that money was from some sort of criminal activity, which I feel like somebody should make a TV series or something based off of that. But either way, there's no evidence that that is happening with the U.S. military and financial aid being provided to Ukraine. Then in terms of where this argument is coming from, you could start by heading over to X or Twitter, type in Ukraine money laundering, and just have a day at it, or a weekend, or a whole week. It's going to take you a long time to dig through all of the random comments talking about Ukrainian money laundering without really pointing back to a specific source or actual proof that that's happening. Instead, we've got some, American media personalities, a U.S. presidential hopeful, and then some significant documents out of Russia and China that all allude to this concept of a Ukrainian money laundering scheme. We'll start here with a clip from Fox correspondent Jesse Waters.
Are sending you billions of dollars of weaponry. The least you could do is reward their favorite mega donor. And what did FTX do with the money Ukraine invested? Well, they plowed it right back into the Democratic Party. Democrats send money to Ukraine. Ukraine sends money to FTX, and FTX sends money to the Democrats' campaigns. Now, I don't know if this is war profiteering or money laundering. I don't even know, but it needs to be investigated.
Look, it's a salacious story. I can understand why this would go viral. You're talking about corruption at the highest level, about a billionaire going down, all mixed together with the largest land war fought in Europe since World War II. The problem here is that it's not exactly true. So there was an Associated Press fact check that came out after this clip. Of course, it didn't get nearly as much attention as the viral clip itself, which, for what it's worth, was circulating on a lot of pro-Russian Telegram channels. But according to the AP fact check, they said the Ukrainian government has not invested nor stored money in FTX, according to the country's Ministry of Digital Transformation. These claims misrepresent a short-term initiative in Ukraine that used FTX to convert cryptocurrency donations for the war effort into government-issued currency. In early March, Aid for Ukraine began working with FTX to convert cryptocurrency donations into Ukraine's government-issued currency, a partnership that ended in April 2022. So in terms of the money laundering accusation in this first clip, there's just not a lot there. And the relationship between Ukraine and FTX ended in April 2022, which is before the majority of U.S. financial and military aid flowed into that country. We've then got a more recent speech on the subject by U.S. presidential hopeful RFK Jr. I'll play just a little clip of that conversation here.
Mitch McConnell was asked, can we really afford to spend $113 billion to Ukraine? He said, don't worry. It's not really going to Ukraine.
It's going to American defense manufacturers.
So he just admitted it's a money laundering scheme.
So kind of similar to one of the things that Jesse Waters pointed out about the possibility of war profiteering, Again, you could come back to a conversation here, and we will, about the military-industrial complex or domestic corruption, but this is not in any way, shape, or form money laundering. Then, of course, this is something that Russia has been pushing forward for some time. I mean, they're going to do anything they can to drive enough division in the United States to where there's no longer support for U.S. military or financial assistance to Ukraine. They're fighting an active war with Ukraine. They want U.S. support to stop. If we look back at this graphic put out in 2022, this was back in the window where Russia was still talking a lot about biolabs. U.S.-funded biolabs is one of the reasons they had to go into Ukraine. Haven't heard a lot about those recently, but anyways, they put out this graphic with images and names of a bunch of senior U.S. officials, including the president's son, Hunter Biden, and they said all of them, in one way or another, are beneficiaries of the Pentagon's biological projects that are linked to the U.S. Democratic Party, whose leaders act as the masterminds of military biological research and the creators of covert money laundering schemes to benefit a narrow circle of U.S. elites. So, not a lot of detail on what exactly the money laundering is. Again, this was also put out in the early days of the war in Ukraine, talking more about biolabs than anything to do with U.S. military or financial assistance to Ukraine while they are fighting their war. Then in May of 2023, Russia jumped on another aspect here, which, to be fair, is pretty troubling from an American perspective. In May, Reuters came out saying that the Pentagon mistakenly inflated the cost of weapons and other military assistance that Washington had sent to Ukraine by at least $3 billion, which, if that sounds shocking, it should be. That's a problem. There's no two ways around that. Now, the way that pro-Russian Telegram channels were presenting this as an aspect of the overall money laundering scheme is they said, quote, now the Americans most likely needed to additionally get rid of the surplus lying around in warehouses, and the mistake leaked into the network creates a convenient excuse for getting rid of unnecessary and money laundering without any consequences for oneself. So kind of what they're getting at is that we were fabricating what we were sending and that we eventually kind of caught ourselves in the act. We're like, oh man, we got all these weapons we said we've been sending over to Ukraine, and we haven't. We've actually got a warehouse full of them. Let's just say there was an accounting error, ship these things over, and we'll cover our tracks. Unfortunately, the Department of Defense being off on something by $3 billion isn't out of the ordinary, which again is a problem for us American citizens. I don't like seeing that. I mean, the DoD has failed 6 consecutive audits. That's not good. There's no good way to frame that, but it's not anything new. This has been an issue for quite a while now within the U.S. Department of Defense. So for Russia to point at one accounting error amidst years of accounting errors to say that one right there, that is evidence of a U.S. money laundering scheme to Ukraine. I just think it's going to be hard to connect all those dots. And then actually the most detailed accusation of this grand U.S.-Ukrainian money laundering scheme came from a Chinese think tank in a report they released in February 2023. The Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies of Renmin University put out a report titled Aid Mixed with Water, Inside Story and Analysis of Western Military Aid to Ukraine. Now this report, it's pretty damning until you get into the fact check, and it actually isn't much at all. In the report, they claim that U.S. aid to Ukraine is seriously watered down, as Kyiv and Ukrainian people only received very little from the huge amount the U.S. had promised, while most of the assistance are actually serving the money laundering plan for the U.S. military-industrial complex. They said that Washington is using, quote, supporting Ukraine as a pretext to make huge amount of taxpayers' money to transfer to the pockets of U.S. military-industrial giants like Lockheed Martin and Raytheon Technologies. They said only about 17% of the 2022 additional Ukraine Supplemental Appropriations Act involving $40 billion is directed to Ukraine, and the rest of the money is suspected of being used for other purposes. They say among the $40 billion, more than $14 billion, accounting for about 36%, has been used for the U.S. itself, such as updating the U.S. arsenals and ammunition and issuing additional wages and allowances for U.S. military personnel. And then lastly here, before we get into the fact check, they'll say another $18.9 billion in aid funds did not specifically target recipient countries, accounting for about 47%. So the public is unable to track where that money goes. Now, I think they wrote this assuming that we didn't have access, or the readers didn't have access to the actual text of the additional Ukraine Supplemental Appropriations Act 2022. We do. I'll put it up on the screen and kind of run through some of this. Overall, as you read this, it makes that Chinese report kind of confusing and to a degree, partially, maybe even made up. So on the screen here, we've got the additional Ukrainian Supplemental Appropriations Act 2022, which Congress said provides more than $40 billion in emergency funding to support the Ukrainian people and defend global democracy in Ukraine in the wake of Russia's unprovoked attack on Ukraine. Now, this report is broken out by where all of the funds are going to go. It's pretty boring to read through it line by line, but it's only like 3 or 4 pages. So I'll link it in the description below if you want to check it out. We're going to run through a couple high-level items here. So the 2 areas I wanted to look at to kind of push back on this Chinese report was, one, saying that all of this money is just being sent to the United States, which is one of these allegations of the money laundering, right? We say it's going to Ukraine, but in reality, those sneaky Americans are just spending it on themselves. So of the $40 billion in this act, it has $9.05 billion to replenish U.S. stocks. So as we sent over a number of, say, artillery rounds, missiles, rockets, drones, whatever it might be, $9.05 billion was allocated for us to make more of those munitions, to resupply our own stockpiles. Shouldn't be a shock. I thought that was pretty clear from the get-go. There was $3.9 billion for mission support. That's troop rotations to Europe. Remember, we've increased our troop posture in Europe since this war began, as well as training Ukrainian forces around the world, really. It costs a lot of money to do that, $3.9 billion to do that. It's got $600 million to mitigate industrial-based constraints for faster missile production. Again, that's coming to the United States. I understand that that's vaguely worded, but the whole concept there is to try to make U.S. military production faster, figure out ways to ease these bottlenecks and get more munitions to the front faster. $550 million is to procure critical munitions for the U.S. stockpiles. So that is not necessarily the U.S. manufacture of weapon systems and munitions, but we're going elsewhere to purchase some of those weapons and munitions to replenish our stockpiles that we send to Ukraine. That's the nefarious money being spent in the United States. It seems pretty clear-cut. You might disagree with it and think it's not the appropriate use of funds, but to say that that's some sneaky use of American taxpayer money, it's right there. It's laid out. It wasn't a secret from like the get-go. Then for the unallocated $18.9 billion, I'm not even sure where they got that. They might have just made that up. I mean, there's things in here that are weird, like the $20 million to reimburse the Bill Emerson Humanitarian Trust, which ties in, I guess, a little bit with combating international famine. So it's kind of connected to the ongoing war in Ukraine, but it's also pretty vague. Honestly, that kind of sounds like the standard fluff that Congress likes to put in any one of these bills. But either way, I think the Chinese think tank here just kind of pulled that $19 billion out, saying that the public doesn't know where it's going, unable to track. I think they pulled that out of thin air. Now, there are a bunch of valid arguments about why the U.S. policy towards Ukraine and sending over weapons and economic aid is not the right policy. It's just that money laundering isn't exactly one of them. Corruption could be, right? And this shouldn't be a shock. Ukraine had major issues with corruption leading up to this war. And while it looks like they've gotten better and have tried to clamp down on that aspect of their society, it's still a major concern. And we've got here the transparency.org Corruption Perceptions Index, which is something interesting to kind of compare the corruption levels in countries around the world. As an idea here, the United States ranks 24 out of 180 with a score of 69. The higher that score, the less corrupt. The lower that score, the more corrupt. So it looks like Canada beats us. But heading over here to Ukraine, we'll zoom in a little bit. Ukraine is ranked 104 out of 180. So they're below the average, right? With a score of 36 out of 100. They're doing better than Russia, who's ranked even lower, 141 out of 180. But Ukraine has improved since the war began, right? A +3 change according to transparency.org. And I think, actually, no longer the most corrupt in Europe, if that statement is still being used. Looking over here at Bosnia and Herzegovina, they are at 35 out of 100 compared to Ukraine's 36 out of 100. So a little bit of a change there. Corruption is bad. And if that's your argument as to why the United States should not continue sending military or financial aid to Ukraine, fine. But say that. Don't say money laundering. Another common thread through a lot of these arguments is that the United States says they're sending this money to Ukraine, but in reality, it's just going into the pockets of the military-industrial complex. Ipso facto, money laundering, which is, misleading, to say the least. So for starters, I do think we've got an issue here with the military-industrial complex. I think that they overcharge the United States in a lot of ways, and I think they have a lot more power over politics that is probably healthy. However, that's not money laundering. Also, the military-industrial complex is not just a group of 4 or 5 people sitting in a room grabbing those aid dollars for Ukraine and actually putting them in their pockets. Instead, it's made up of companies that are based all around the United States, American companies in the United States, staffed by American workers. So that money is going back into the U.S. economy. Again, there's a valid argument to be had as to the power and the leverage of these companies that make up the military-industrial complex. And I think it's a very good argument to have. That's also not money laundering. Then to step away entirely from these Chinese and Russian arguments, you might feel that the United States' time is better spent on something like China, or maybe here domestically. We've got so much going on inside of our country. We need to take care of our citizens first before we start looking at, major aid packages to a country like Ukraine. I got it. I think those are all valid arguments to be had. But can we just maybe stop giving any airtime to the idea that Ukraine is a giant money laundering scheme for the United States? There's just, at this point, no evidence to support that. But that's all I got for now. Of course, if interested in this or other national security subjects, be sure to check out our Substack, linked in the description below. Substack's like a mix of a newsletter and a website. So we put out like 3 to 4 new articles per week. If you sign up, they'll come direct to your inbox. And we talk about things like China's Little Blue Men, a militia in the South China Sea, 3D printed weapons in Myanmar, Ukraine hunting Wagner forces in Africa, and then the weapons and munitions shortage facing both Russia and Ukraine in that ongoing war. Again, linked in the description below if interested. But thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.